Welcome to Fairy Tale with Stories with Liz, an Anderson fairy tale. It is called The Real Princess. Let's see how that one goes. There once was a prince, and he wanted a princess. But then she must be a real princess. He traveled right round the world to find one, but there was always something wrong. There were plenty of princesses, but whether they were real princesses, he had great difficulty in discovering. There was always something which was not quite right about them. So at last he had to come home again, and he was very sad, 'cause he wanted a real princess so badly. One evening there was a terrible storm. It thundered and lightened, and rain poured down in torrents. Indeed, it was a fearful night. In the middle of the storm, somebody knocked at the town gate. The old king himself went down to open it. It was a princess who stood outside, but she was in terrible state from the rain and the storm. The water streamed out of her hair and her clothes. It ran into the top of her shoes and out at the heel. But she said she was a real princess. "Well, we shall see if that is true," thought the old queen, but she said nothing. She went into the bedroom, took all the bedclothes off, and laid a pea on the bedstead. Then she took 20 mattresses and piled them on top of the pea, and then 20 feather beds on top of the mattresses. This was where the princess was to sleep that night. In the morning they asked her how she had slept. "Oh, terribly badly," said the princess. "I have hardly closed my eyes all night. Heaven knows what was in the bed. I seem to be lying upon some hard thing, and my whole body is black and blue this morning. Oh, it is terrible." They saw at once that she must be a real princess. When she had felt the pea through 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds, nobody but a real princess could have such delicate skin. So the prince took her to be his wife, for now he was sure that he had found a real princess, and the pea was put in a museum, where it might still be seen if nobody has stolen it. Now this is a true story. The end. It is called The Three Billy Goat Gruff, or in Norwegian, Bukkene Bruse. Once on a time there were 3 billy goats who were going up on the hillside to make themselves fat, and they were all called Gruff. On the way up was a bridge over a burn they had to cross, and under the bridge lived a great ugly troll, with eyes as big as saucers and nose as long as a poker. So first of all came the youngest billy goat Gruff to cross the bridge. Trip, trap, trip, trap, went the bridge. "Who is that tripping over my bridge?" roared the troll.
"Oh, it is only I, the tiniest billy goat Gruff. I am going up to the hillside to make myself fat," said the billy goat with such a small voice.
"Now I'm coming to gobble you up,"
said the troll. "Oh no, pray, don't take me. I'm too little, that I am," said the billy goat. "Wait a bit till the second billy goat Gruff comes. He is much bigger."
"Well, be off with you,"
said the troll. A little while after came the second billy goat Gruff to cross the bridge. Trip, trap, trip, trap, went the bridge.
Who is that tripping over my bridge?
roared the troll again.
Oh, it's the second billy goat, Gruff. I am going up the hillside to make myself fat,
said the billy goat, who hadn't such a small voice.
Now I'm coming to gobble you up,
said the troll. Oh no, don't take me. I'm too little. Wait a little till the big billy goat Gruff comes. He is much bigger,
Well, be off with you.
said the troll.
Trip, trap, trip, trap, trip, trap.
Went the bridge, for the big billy goat was so heavy that the bridge creaked and groaned under him.
Who is that tripping over my bridge? Roared the troll again. It is I, the big billy goat Gruff,
said the billy goat, who had an ugly hoarse voice of his own.
Now I'm coming to gobble you up,
said the troll.
Well, come along. I've got 2 spears, and I'll poke your eyeballs out at your ears. I've got besides 2 curling stones, and I'll crush you to bits, body and bones.
That was what the big billy goat said, and so he flew at the troll and poked his eyes out with his horns and crushed him to bits, body and bone, and tossed him into the burn. And after that they all went up to the hillside. There the billy goats got so fat that they were scarce able to walk home again, and if the fat hasn't fallen off them, why, they are still fat. And so, snip, snap, snout, the tale is told out. Lazy Jack. Once on a time there was a boy whose name was Jack, and he lived with his mother on a common. They were very poor, and the old woman got her living by spinning, but Jack was so lazy that he would do nothing but bask in the sun in the hot weather and sit by the corner of the hearth in the winter time, so they called him Lazy Jack. His mother could not get him to do anything for her, and at last told him one Monday that if he did not begin to work for his porridge, she would turn him out to get his living as he could. This roused Jack, and he went out and hired himself for the next day to a neighboring farmer for a penny. But as he was coming home, never having had any money before, he lost it passing over a brook. "You stupid boy," said his mother. "You should have put it in your pocket."
I'll do so another time,
said Jack. Well, the next day, Jack went out again and hired himself to a cow-keeper, who gave him a jar of milk for his day's work. Jack took the jar and put it into the large pocket of his jacket, spilling it all long before he came home. "Dear me," said his mother, "you should have carried it on your head."
I'll do so another time,
said Jack. So the following day, Jack hired himself again to a farmer who agreed to give him cream cheese for his services. In the evening, Jack took the cheese and went home with it on his head. By the time he got home, the cheese was all spoiled, part of it being lost and part mated with his hair. "You stupid lout," said his mother. "You should have carried it very carefully in your hands."
I'll do so another time,
said Jack. Now the next day, Lazy Jack went out again and hired himself to a baker who would give him nothing for his work but a large tomcat. Jack took the cat and began carrying it very carefully in his hands, but in a short time Pussy scratched him so much that he was compelled to let it go. When he got home, his mother said to him, "You silly fellow, you should have tied it to a string and dragged it along after you."
I'll do so another time,
said Jack. On the following day, Jack hired himself to a butcher, who rewarded him by the handsome present of a shoulder of mutton. Jack took the mutton, tied it to a string, and trailed it along after him in the dirt, so that by the time he got home, the meat was completely spoiled. His mother was this time quite out of patience with him, for the next day was Sunday, and she was obliged to have cabbage for her dinner. "You ninny hammer," said she to her son, "you should have carried it on your shoulder."
"I'll do so another time,"
replied Jack. Well, on the Monday, Lazy Jack went once more and hired himself to a cattle keeper, who gave him a donkey for his trouble. Now, though Jack was strong, he found it hard to hoist the donkey on his shoulder, but at last he did it, and began walking slowly home with the prize on his shoulders. Now, it so happened that in the course of his journey he passed a house where a rich man lived with his only daughter, a beautiful girl who was both deaf and dumb, and had never laughed in her whole life. So the father had given out that any man who could make her laugh would receive her hand in marriage. Now, this young lady happened to be looking out of the window when Jack was passing by with the donkey on his shoulders, and the poor beast with its legs striking up in the air was kicking violently and hee-hawing with all its might. Well, the sight was so comical that she burst into a great fit of laughter, and immediately recovered her speech and hearing. Her father was overjoyed and fulfilled his promise by marrying her to Lazy Jack, who was thus made a rich man. They lived in a large house, and Jack's mother lived with them in great happiness until she died. The end. It is called The Horned Women. A rich woman sat up late one night, carding and preparing wool, while all the family and servants were asleep. Suddenly a knock was given at the door, and a voice called, "Open! Open!" "Who is there?" said the woman of the house. "I am the witch of the one horn," answered the woman. The mistress, supposing that one of her neighbors had called and required assistance, opened the door, and a woman entered, having in her hand a pair of wool carders, and bearing a horn on her forehead as if it grew there. She sat down by the fire in silence and began to card the wool with violent haste. Suddenly she paused and said aloud, "Where are the women? They delay too long." Then a second knock came to the door, and a voice called as before, "Open! Open!" The mistress felt herself obliged to rise and open to the call, and immediately a second witch entered, having 2 horns on her forehead, and in her hand a wheel of spinning wool. "Give me place," she said. "I am the witch of 2 horns." And she began to spin as quick as lightning. And so the knocks went on, and the call was heard, and the witches entered, until 12 women sat round the fire, the first with 1 horn, the last with 12. And they carded and threaded and turning their spinning wheels, and wound and wove, all singing together in ancient rhyme, but no word did they speak to the mistress of the house. Strange to hear and frightful to look upon were these 12 women, with their horns and their wheels, and the mistress felt near to death. And she tried to rise that she might call for help, but she could not move, nor could she utter a cry or word, for the spell of the witches were upon her. Then one of them called to her in Irish and said, "Rise, woman, and make us a cake." Then the mistress searched for a vessel to bring water from the well, that she might mix the meal and make the cake, but she could find none. And they said to her, "Take a sieve and bring water in it." And she took the sieve and went to the well, but the water poured from it, and she could fetch none for the cake, and she sat down by the well and wept. Then a voice came by her and said, "Take yellow clay and moss and bind them together, and plaster the sieve so that it will hold." This she did, and the sieve held the water for the cake, and the voice said again, "Return, and when thou comest to the north angle of the house, cry aloud 3 times and say, 'The mountain of the Fenian women, and the sky over it is all on fire.'" And she did so. When the witches inside heard the call, a great and terrible cry broke from their lips, and they rushed forth with wild lamentations and shrieks, and fled away to Slivnamon, where was their chief abode. But the spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches, if they were to return again. And first, to break their spells, she sprinkled the water in which she had washed her child's feet, the feet water, outside the door on the threshold. Secondly, she took the cake which in her absence the witches had made of meal mixed with blood drawn from her sleeping family. And she broke the cake in bits and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took the cloth they had woven and placed it half in and half out of the chest with the padlock, and lastly she secured the door with a great crossbeam fastened in the jambs, so the witches could not enter. And having done all these things, she waited. Not long were the witches in coming back, and they raged and called for vengeance. "Open, open," they screamed. "Open, feet water." "I cannot," said the feet water. "I am scattered on the ground, and my path is down to the lock." "Open, open, wood and trees and beam," they cried to the door. "I cannot," said the door, "for the beam is fixed in the jambs, and I have no power to move." "Open, open, open, cake that we have made and mingled with blood," they cried again. "I cannot," said the cake, "for I am broken and bruised, and my blood is on the lips of the sleeping children." Then the witches rushed through the air with great cries, and fled back to Slievenamon, uttering strange curses on the spirit of the well for having wished their ruin. But the woman and the house were left in peace, and a mantle dropped by one of the witches in her flight was kept hung up by the mistress in memory of that night, and this mantle was kept by the same family from generation to generation for 500 years. The end of that little Irish fairy tale. Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time there was a dear little girl who was loved by everyone who looked at her, but most of all by her grandmother, and there was nothing that she would not have given to the child. Once she gave her a little cap of red velvet, which suited her so well that she would never wear anything else, so she was always called Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Come, little Red Cap, there is a piece of cake and a bottle of wine. Take them to your grandmother. She is ill and weak, and they will do her good. Set out before it gets hot, and when you are going, walk nicely and quietly, and do not run off the path, or you may fall and break the bottle, and then your grandmother will get nothing. And when you go into her room, don't forget to say good morning, and don't peep into every corner of the room before you do it." "I'll take great care," said Little Red Riding Hood to her mother, and gave her hand on it. The grandmother lived out in the wood, half a league from the village, and just as Little Red Riding Hood entered the wood, a wolf met her. Little Red Riding Hood did not know what a wicked creature he was, and was not at all afraid of him.
"Good day, Little Red Riding Hood,"
said he. Thank you kindly, Wolf.
Whither away so early, Little Red Riding Hood?
To my grandmother's.
What have you got in your apron?
Cake and wine. Yesterday was baking day. So poor sick grandmother is to have something good to make her stronger.
Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?
A good quarter of a league further on in the wood. Her house stands under 3 large oak trees. 3 nut trees are just below. You surely must know it, replied Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought to himself,
What a tender young creature! What a nice plump mouthful! She will be better to eat than the old woman. I must act craftily so as to catch them both.
So he walked for a short time by the side of Little Red Riding Hood, and then he said,
See, Little Red Riding Hood, how pretty the flowers are about here. Why do you not look around? I believe, too, that you do not hear how sweetly the little birds are singing. You walk gravely along as if you were going to school, while everything else out here in the wood is merry.
Little Red Riding Hood raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunbeams dancing here and there through the trees, and pretty flowers growing everywhere, she thought, Suppose I take grandmother a fresh nosegay. That would please her too. It is so early in the day that I shall still get there in good time. And so she ran from the path and into the wood to look for flowers, and whenever she had picked one, she fancied that she saw a still prettier one further on and ran after it, and so got deeper and deeper into the wood. Meanwhile, the wolf ran straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. Who's there?
Little Redcap, replied the wolf. She's bringing cake and wine. Open the door.
Lift the hatch, called out the grandmother. I am too weak and cannot get up. The wolf lifted the hatch, and the door sprang open, and without saying a word, he went straight to the grandmother's bed and devoured her. Then he put on her clothes, dressed himself in her cap, laid himself in bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Riding Hood, however, had been running about picking flowers, and when she had gathered so many that she could carry no more, she remembered her grandmother and set out on her way to her. She was surprised to find the cottage door standing open, and when she went into the room, she had such a strange feeling that she said to herself, Oh dear, how uneasy I feel today. And at other times I like being with grandmother so much. She called out, Good morning, but received no answer, so she went to the bed and drew back the curtains. There lay her grandmother, with her cap pulled far over her face and looking very strange. Oh, grandmother, she said, what big ears you have.
The better to hear you with, my child,
was the reply. But grandmother, what big eyes you have, she said.
The better to see you with, my dear.
But grandmother, what large hands you have.
The better to hug you with.
Oh, but grandmother, what a terribly large mouth you have.
The better to eat you with.
And scarcely had the wolf said this, than with one bound he was out of bed and swallowed up Little Red Riding Hood. When the wolf had appeased his appetite, he lay down again in the bed, fell asleep, and began to snore very loudly. The huntsman was just passing the house and thought to himself,
How the old woman is snoring. I must just see if she wants anything.
So he went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw that the wolf was lying in it.
Do I find you here, you old sinner? I have long sought you.
Then, just as he was going to fire at him, it occurred to him that the wolf might have devoured the grandmother and that she might still be saved, so he did not fire, but took a pair of scissors and began to cut open the stomach of the sleeping wolf. When he had made 2 snips, he saw the little red cap shining, and then he made 2 snips more, and the little girl sprang out crying. "Oh, how frightened I have been! How dark it was inside of the wolf!" And after that, the aged grandmother came out alive also, but scarcely able to breathe. Little Red Riding Hood, however, quickly fetched great stones with which they filled the wolf's belly, and when he awoke, he wanted to run away, but the stones were so heavy that he collapsed at once and fell dead. Then all 3 were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Little Red Riding Hood had brought, and revived. But Little Red Riding Hood thought to herself, "As long as I live, I will never by myself stray from the path and run into the wood, when my mother has forbidden me to do so." It also related that once, when Little Red Riding Hood was again taking cakes to the old grandmother, another wolf spoke to her and tried to entice her from the path. Little Red Riding Hood, however, was on her guard and went straight forward on her way and told her grandmother that she had met the wolf and that he had said good morning to her, but with such a wicked look in his eyes that if they had not been on the public road, she was certain that he would have eaten her up. "Well," said the grandmother, "we will shut the door that he may not come in." Soon afterwards the wolf knocked and cried,
Open the door, grandmother. I am Little Red Cap, and am bringing you some cakes.
But they did not speak or open the door, so the grey beard stole twice or thrice round the house, and at last jumped on the roof, intending to wait until Little Red Riding Hood went home in the evening, and then to steal after her and devour her in the darkness. But the grandmother saw what was in his thoughts. In front of the house was a great stone trough, so she said to the child, "Take the pail, Little Red Riding Hood. I made some sausages yesterday, so carry the water in which I boiled them to the trough." Little Red Riding Hood carried until the great trough was quite full. Then the smell of the sausages reached the wolf, and he sniffed and peeped down, and at last stretched out his neck so far that he could no longer keep his footing, and began to slip, and slipped down from the roof straight into the great trough, and was drowned. But Little Red Riding Hood went joyously home, and no one ever did anything to harm her again. The end. It is called Ash Lad Who Competed with the Troll. It was gathered by Asbjørnsen and Moe. Ash Lad Who Competed with the Troll. Once on a time there was a farmer who had 3 sons. His means were small, and he was old and frail, and his sons would take to nothing. A splendid large wood belonged to the farm, and one day the father told his sons to go fell some trees in order to pay off some debts. At long last he got them to set off. The eldest was to go first. But when he got well into the wood and began hacking at a mossy old fir, a great monstrous troll came towards him.
If you chop down trees in this wood of mine,
said the troll,
I will kill you.
When the lad heard that, he threw down his axe and ran off home as fast as he could lay legs to the ground. He arrived quite out of breath and told them what had happened, but his father said that he had the heart of a rabbit. No troll would have ever scared him from chopping wood when he was young. The next day the second son set off, but it went just the same. He had scarce hacked 3 strokes at the fir before the troll came to him too and said,
If you chop down trees in this wood of mine, I will kill you.
The lad dared not so much as look at him, but threw down the axe, took to his heels, and came scampering home just like his brother. So when he got home, his father was angry again, and said no troll had ever scared him when he was young. The third day Ashlad wanted to set off. "You, indeed," said the 2 elder brothers. "You will do it bravely, no doubt. You have scarce ever set your foot out the door." Ashlad said nothing in reply, but only begged his mother to give him plenty of provisions to take along. She had no cheese, so she set the pot on to the fire to make him a little. He put it in his sack and set off. When he had chopped for a short while, the troll came to him too and said,
If you chop down trees in this forest of mine, I will kill you.
but the lad was not slow. He pulled his cheese out of the bag and squeezed it so hard that the whey burst out. "Hold your tongue," he cried to the troll, "or I'll squeeze you as I squeeze the water out of this white rock."
Nay, spare me, dear friend, said the troll. If you spare me, I'll help you chop down some trees.
Well, on those terms the lad was willing to spare him, and the troll chopped so bravely that they felled dozens of trees that day. But when the evening drew near, the troll said,
Now you'd better come home with me, for my house is nearer than yours.
The lad was willing enough. When they reached the troll's house, the troll was to make up the fire, while the lad was to fetch the water for their porridge pot. But the 2 iron buckets were so big and heavy, he couldn't even budge them. "Pooh," said the lad, "it isn't worth while to carry mere timbles like these. I'll just go and fetch the whole well."
Nay, nay, dear friend, said the troll. I can't afford to lose my well. Just you make up the fire, and I'll go fetch the water.
So when he came back with the water, they set to and boiled up a great pot of porridge. "It's all the same to me," said the lad, "but if you're same-minded, we'll eat a match."
With all my heart,
said the troll, for he thought he could surely hold his own in eating. So they sat down, but the lad took his sack unawares to the troll and hung it before him, and so he spooned more into the sack than he ate himself. And when the sack was full, he took up his knife and made a slit in it. The troll looked on all the while, but said never a word. But when they had eaten a good bit longer, the troll laid down his spoon, saying,
Nay, I can't eat another bite.
"But you have to eat," said Ashlad. "I'm only half done. Why don't you do as I did and slice a hole in your stomach? Then you'll be able to eat as much as you please."
But won't that hurt cruelly?
asked the troll. "Oh," said the youth, "nothing to speak of." So the troll did as the lad said, and then you must know that proved the death of him. Then the lad took all the silver and gold that he found inside the mountain and went home. And you may fancy that it went a great way to pay off the debt. The end.
Thomas Bulfinch and his interpretation of the story of Prometheus and Pandora. Before earth and sea and heaven were created, all things were one aspect, to which we give the name of chaos.
a confused and shapeless mass, nothing but dead weight, in which, however, slumbered the seeds of things. Earth, sea, and air were all mixed up together, so the earth was not solid, the sea was not fluid, and the air was not transparent. God and nature at last interposed and put an end to this discord, separating the earth from sea and heaven from both. The fiery part, being the lightest, sprang up and formed the skies. The air was next in weight and place, the earth, being heavier, sank below, and the water took the lowest place and buoyed up the earth. Here some god, it is not known which, gave his good offices in arranging and disposing the earth. He appointed rivers and bays their places, raised mountains, stooped out valleys, distributed woods, fountains, fertile fields, and stony plains. The air being cleared, the stars began to appear, fishes took possession of the sea, birds of the air, and four-footed beasts of the earth. But another animal was wanted, and man was made. It is not known whether the Creator made him of divine materials, or whether in the earth, so lately separated from heaven, there lurked still some heavenly seeds. Prometheus took some of this earth, and kneading it up with water, made man in the image of the gods. He gave him an upright stature, so that while all other animals turn their face downwards and look at the earth, he raises his to heaven and looks at the stars. Prometheus was one of the Titans, a gigantic race, who inhabited the earth before men. To him and his brother Epimetheus was committed the office of making man and providing him and all other animals with the faculties necessary for their preservation. Epimetheus undertook to do this, and Prometheus was to overlook his work when it was done. Epimetheus accordingly proceeded to bestow upon the different animals the various gifts of courage, strength, swiftness, sagacity, wings to one, claws to another, a shelly covering to a third, etc. But when man came to be provided for, who was supposed to be superior to all other animals, Epimetheus had been so prodigal of all his resources that he had nothing left to bestow upon man. In his perplexity, he resorted to his brother Prometheus, who, with the aid of Minerva, went up to heaven and lighted his torch at the chariot of the sun and brought down fire to man. With this gift, man was more than a match for all other animals. It enabled him to make weapons wherewith to subdue them, tools to which to cultivate the earth, to warm his dwelling, so as to be comparatively independent of climate, and finally to introduce the arts and to coin money, the means of trade and commerce. Woman was not yet made. The story, absurd enough, is that Jupiter made her and sent her to Prometheus and his brother to punish them for their presumption in stealing fire from heaven and men for accepting the gift. The first woman was named Pandora. She was made in heaven, every god contributing something to perfect her. Venus gave her beauty, Mercury persuasion, Apollo music, etc. Thus equipped, she was conveyed to earth and presented to Epimetheus, who gladly accepted her, though cautioned by his brother to be aware of Jupiter and his gifts. Epimetheus had in his house a jar in which were kept certain nauseous articles, for which, in fitting man for his new abode, he had had no occasion. Pandora was seized with an eager curiosity to know what this jar contained, and one day she slipped off the cover and looked in. Forthwith there escaped a multitude of plagues for heedless men, such as gout, rheumatism, and colic for his body, and envy, spite, and revenge for his mind, and scattered themselves far and wide. Pandora hastened to replace the lid, but alas, the whole content of the jar had escaped, one thing only excepted, which lay at the bottom, and that was hope. So we see at this day, wherever evil are abroad, hope never entirely leave us. And while we have that, no amount of ills can make us completely wretched. Another story is that Pandora was sent in good faith by Jupiter to bless men, that she was furnished with a box containing her marriage present, in which every god had put some blessing. She opened the box incautiously, and the blessings all escaped, hope only accepted. This story seems more probable than the former, for how could hope, so precious a jewel as it is, have been kept in a jar full of all manners of evil, as suggested in the previous story? The world being thus furnished with inhabitants, the first age was an age of innocence and happiness, called the Golden Age. Truth and pride prevailed, though not enforced by law, nor was there any magistrate to threaten or punish. The forest had not yet been robbed of its trees to furnish timbers for vessels, nor had men built fortifications round their towns. There were no such things as swords and spears and helmets. The earth brought forth all things necessary for man, without his labor in ploughing or sowing. Perpetual spring reigned, flowers sprang up without seeds, the rivers flowed with milk and wine, and yellow honey distilled from the oaks. Then succeeded the Silver Age, inferior to that of the Golden, but better than that of the Bronze. Jupiter shortened the spring and divided the year into seasons. Then first men had to endure the extremities of heat and cold, and houses became necessary. Caves were the first dwellings, and leafy coverts of the woods, and huts woven of twigs. Crops would no longer grow without planting. The farmer was obliged to sow the seeds, and toiling ox to draw the plough. Next came the Brazen Age, more savage of temper, and readier to the strife of arms, yet not altogether wicked. The hardest and worst was the Iron Age. Crime burst in like a flood, modesty, truth, and honor fled. In their places came fraud and cunning, violence, and wicked love of gain. Then seamen spread sails to the wind, and the trees were torn from the mountains to serve for keels to ships, and vexed the face of the ocean. The earth, which till now had been cultivated in common, began to be divided into possession. Men were not satisfied with what surface produced, and must dig into its bowels, and draw forth from thence the ores of metals. Mischievous iron and more mischievous gold were produced. War sprang up, using both as weapons. The guest was not safe in his friend's house, and sons-in-laws and fathers-in-laws, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, could not trust one another. Sons wished their fathers dead, that they might come to the inheritance. Family love lay prostrate. The earth was wet with slaughter, and the gods abandoned it one by one, till Astrea alone was left, and finally she also took her departure. Jupiter, seeing the state of things, burned with anger. He summoned the gods to council. They obeyed the call and took the road to the palace of heaven. The road, which one may see in a clear night, stretched across the face of the sky, and it is called the Milky Way. Along the road stands the palace of the illustrious gods. The common people of the skies live apart on either side. Jupiter addressed the assembly. He set forth the frightful condition of things on the earth, and closed by announcing his intention to destroy the whole of its inhabitants, and provide a new race, unlike the first, who would be more worthy of life, and much better worshippers to the gods. So saying, he took a thunderbolt, and was about to launch it at the world, and destroy it by burning. But, recollecting the danger that such a conflagration might set heaven itself on fire, he changed his plan, and resolved to drown it. The north wind, which scattered the clouds, was chained up. The south was set out, and soon covered all the face of the heaven with a cloak of pitchy darkness. The clouds, driven together, resounded with a crash. Torrents of rain fell. The crops are laid low. The year's labor of the husbandman perishes in an hour. Jupiter, not satisfied with his own waters, called on his brother Neptune to aid him with his. He let loose the rivers and pours them all over the land. At the same time, he heaves the land with the earthquake and brings in the reflux of the ocean over the shores. Flocks, herds, men, and houses are swept away, and temples with their sacred enclosures profaned. If any edifice remained standing, it was overwhelmed, and its turrets lay hid behind the waves. Now all was sea without shore. Here and there an individual remained on a projecting hilltop, and a few in boats pulled the oar where they had lately driven the plough. The fish swam among the treetops. The anchor is let down into a garden, where the graceful lambs played but now, unwieldy sea calves gambol. The wolf swims among the sheep, the yellow lion and tiger struggle in the water. The strength of the wild bear saves him not, nor his swiftness the stag. The birds fall with weary wings into the water, having found no land for resting place. Those living beings whom the water spared fell a prey to hunger. Pronossus alone of all the mountains overtopped the waves, and there Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, of the race of Prometheus, found refuge, he a just man, and she a faithful worshipper of the gods. Jupiter, when he saw none left alive but this pair, he remembered their harmless lives and previous demeanor, ordered the north wind to drive away the clouds, and disclosed the skies to earth, and earth to the skies. Neptune also directed Triton to blow on his shell and sound a retreat to the waters. The waters obeyed, and the sea resounded its shores, and the rivers to their channels. Then Deucalion thus addressed Pyrrha: "O wife, only surviving woman, joined to me first by ties of kindred and marriage, and now by a common danger. Would that we possessed the power of our ancestor Prometheus, and could renew the race as he first made it. But as we cannot, let us seek yonder temple, and inquire the gods what remains for us to do." They entered the temple, deformed as it was with slime, and approached the altar, where no fire burned. There they fell prostrate on the earth, and prayed the goddess to inform them how they might retrieve their miserable affairs. The oracle answered: "Depart from the temple with heads veiled and garments unbound, and cast behind you the bones of your mother." They heard the words with astonishment. Pyrrha first broke silence. "We cannot obey. We dare not profane the remains of our parents." They sought thickest shades of the wood, and revolved the oracle in their minds. At length Deucalion spoke: "Either the sagacity deceives me, or the command is one we may obey without impiety. The earth is the great parent of us all. The stones are her bones. These we may cast behind us, and I think it is this that the oracle means. At least, it will do no harm to try." They veiled their faces, unbound their garments, and picked up stones and cast them behind them. The stones, wonderful to relate, began to grow and assume shape. By degrees, they put on a rude resemblance of the human form, like a block half finished in the hands of the sculptor. The moisture and slime that were about them became flesh, the stony part became bones, the veins remained veins, retaining their name, only changing their hues. Those thrown by the hand of the man became men, and those thrown by the hand of the woman became women. And it was a hard race, and well adapted to labor, as we find ourselves to be at this day, given plain indication to our origin. The end of that myth of creation. This story is called Syrinx. As the evening shadows lengthen, and the night wind softly steals through the trees, touching with restless fingers the still water of the little lochans that would fain have rest, there can be heard a long, long whisper like a sigh. There is no softer, sadder note to be heard in all Pan's great orchestra, nor can one marvel that it should be so, for the whisper comes from the reeds, who gently sway their heads while the wind passes over them as they grow by lonely lake or river. This is the story of Syrinx, the reeds, as Ovid has told it to us. In Arcadia there dwelt a nymph whose name was Syrinx. So fair she was that for her dear sake fauns and satyrs forgot to gambol, and sat in the green woods in thoughtful stillness, that they might see her as she passed. But for none of them had Syrinx a word of kindness. She had no wish for love. The one only of the gods did she give her loyal alliance. She worshipped Diana, and with her followed the chase. As she lightly sped through the forest, she might have been Diana herself, and there were those who said they would not know nymph from goddess, but that the goddess carried a silver bow, while that of Syrinx was made of horn. Fearless and without a care or sorrow, Syrinx passed her happy days. Not for all the gold of Midas would she have changed places with those lovelorn nymphs who sighed their hearts out for the love of man or gods. Heart-whole, fancy-free, gay and happy and lithe and strong, as a young boy whose joy it is to run and to excel in the chase, was Syrinx, whose white arms against the greenwood trees dazzled the eyes of the watching fawns when she drew back her bow to speed an arrow at the stag that she had been hunting since early morning. Each morning that she awoke was the morning of a day of joy. Each night that she lay down to rest, it was to sleep as a child who smiles in its sleep at the remembrance of a perfect day. But to Syrinx, who knew no fear, fear came at last. She was returning one evening from the shadowy hills, untired by the chase that had lasted for many an hour, when, face to face, she met with one whom hitherto she had only seen from afar. Of him the other nymphs spoke often. Who was as great as Pan? Pan who ruled the woods. None could stand against Pan. Those who defied him must ever come under his power in the end. He was fear, he was youth, he was joy, he was love, he was beast, he was power, he was man, he was God. He was life itself, so they did say. So did they talk. And Syrinx listened with a smile. Not Pan himself could bring fear to her. Yet, when he met her in the silent loneliness of a great forest and stood in her path and gazed on her with eyes of joyous amazement that one so fair should be in his kingdom without him having knowledge of it, Syrinx felt something come to her heart that had never before assailed it. Pan's head was crowned with sharp pine leaves, his face was young and beautiful, and yet older than the mountains and the seas. Sadness and joy were in his eyes at the same time, and at the same moment there looked out from them unutterable tenderness and merciless cruelty. For only a little space of time did he stand and hold her eyes with his own, and then in low, caressing voice he spoke. And his words were like the song of a bird to his mate, like the call of the earth to the sun in spring, like the lap of the waves when they tell the rocks of their eternal longing. Of love he spoke, of love that demanded love, and of the nymph's most perfect beauty. Yet as he spoke, the unknown thing came and smote with icy hands the heart of Syrinx. "Ah, I have fear! I have fear!" she cried. And more cruel grew the cruelty in the eyes of Pan. But his words were still the words of passionate tenderness. Like a bird that trembles, helpless before the serpent that would slay it, so did Syrinx, the huntress, stand, and her face in the shade of the forest was like the white lily in the night. But when the god would have drawn her close to him and kissed her red lips, fear leaped into terror, and terror winged her feet. Never in the chase with Diana had she run as she now ran. But like a rushing storm did Pan pursue her, and when he laughed, she knew that what the nymphs had said was true. He was fear, he was power, he was beast. He was life itself. The darkness of the forest swiftly grew more dark. The climbing trails of ivy and the fragrant creeping plants caught her flying feet and made her stumble. Branches and twigs grew alive and snatched at her and balked her as she passed. Trees blocked her path. All nature had grown cruel, and everywhere there seemed to be a murmur of mocking laughter. Laughter from the creatures of Pan, echoing the merciless merriment of their lord and master. Nearer he came, ever nearer. Almost she could feel his breath on her neck, but even as he stretched out his arms to seize the nymph, whose breath came with sobs like that of a young doe spent by the chase, they reached the brink of the river Lathan. And to her watery sisters, the nymphs of the river, Syrinx breathed a desperate prayer for pity and for help. Then stumbled forward a quarry run to the death. With an exultant shout, Pan grasped her as she fell. And lo, in his arms he held no exquisite body with fiercely beating heart, but a clump of slender reeds. Baffled, he stood for a little space, and as he stood, the savagery of the beast faded from his eyes that were fathomless as dark mountain tarns where the sun rays seldom come, and there came into them a man's unutterable woe. At the reeds by the river he gazed and sighed a great sigh, the sigh that comes from the heart of a god who thinks of the pain of the world. Like a gentle zephyr the sigh breathed through the reeds, and from the reeds there came a sound, as of the sobbing sorrow of the world's desire. Then Pan drew his sharp knife, and with it he cut 7 of the reeds that grew by the murmuring river. "Thus shall thy still be mine, my Syrinx," he said. Deftly he bound them together, cut them into unequal length, and fashioned for himself an instrument that to this day is called the Syrinx, or Pan's pipes. So did the god make music. And all that night he sat by the swift-flowing river, and the music from his pipe of reeds was so sweet and yet so passing sad that it seemed as though the very heart of earth itself was telling of its sadness. Thus Syrinx still lives, still dies. And as the evening light comes down on silent places and the trembling shadows fall on the water, we can hear her mournful whisper through the swaying of the reeds. Brown and silvery golden, that grow by lonely lake and river. The end. King Midas of the Golden Touch. In the plays of Shakespeare, we have 3 distinct divisions, 3 separate volumes. One deals with tragedy, another with comedy, and the third with history. And a mistake made by the young in their aspect of life is that they do the same thing. They keep tragedy and comedy severely apart, relegating them to separate volumes that, so they think, have nothing to do with each other. But those who have passed many milestones on the road know that history is the only right label for the book of life's many parts, and that the actors in the great play are in truth tragic comedians. This is the story of Midas, one of the chief tragic comedians of mythology. Once upon a time, the kingdom of Phrygia lacked a king, and in much perplexity the people sought help from an oracle, and the answer was definite. The first man who enters your city riding in a car shall be your king. That day there came slowly jogging into the city in their heavy wooden-wheeled wain the peasant Gordius and his wife and son, whose destination was the marketplace, and whose business was to sell the produce of their little farm and vineyard, fowls, a goat or two, and a couple of skinful of strong purple-red wine. An eager crowd awaited their entry, and a loud shout of welcome greeted them. And their eyes grew round, and their mouths fell open in amaze when they were hailed as King and Queen and Prince of Phrygia. The gods had indeed bestowed upon Gordius, the low-born peasant, a surprising gift. But he showed his gratitude by dedicating his wagon to the deity of the oracle and tying it up in its place with the wiliest knot that his simple wisdom knew, pulled as tight as his brawny arms and strong raw hands could pull. Nor could anyone untie the Gordian knot, and therefore became, as the oracle promised, Lord of Asia, until centuries had passed and Alexander the Great came to Phrygia and sliced through the knot with his all-conquering sword. In time, Midas, the son of Gordius, became the inheritor of the throne and crown of Phrygia. Like many others not born and bred to the purple, his honor sat heavily upon him. From the day that his father's wain had entered the city amidst the acclamations of the people, he had learned the value of power, and therefore from his boyhood onward, power, always more power, was what he coveted. Also, his peasant father had taught him that gold could buy power. And so Midas ever longed for more gold that could buy him a place in the world that no descendant of the long race of kings should be able to contest. And from Olympus the god looked down and smiled and vowed that Midas should have the chance to realize his desires. Therefore one day when he and his court were sitting in the solemn state that Midas required, there rode into their midst, tipsily swaying on the back of a gentle full-fed old grey ass, ivory-crowned, jovial and foolish, the satyr Silenus, guardian of the young god Bacchus. With all the deference due to the friend of a god, Midas treated this disreputable old pedagogue, and for 10 days and nights on end he feasted him royally. On the 11th day Bacchus came in search of his preceptor, and in deep gratitude bade Midas demand of him what he would, because he had done Silenus honor, when to dishonor him lay in his powers. Not even for a moment did Midas ponder. "I should have gold," he said hastily, "much gold. I would have that touch by which all common and valueless things become golden treasures." And Bacchus, knowing that here spoke the son of a peasant, who many times had gone empty to bed after a day of toilful striving on the rocky uplands of Phrygia, looked a little sadly in the eager face of Midas, and answered, "Be it as thy will. Thine shall be the golden touch." Then Bacchus and Silenus went away, a rout of singing revellers at their heels, and Midas quickly put to proof the words of Bacchus. An olive tree grew near where he stood, and from it he picked a little twig decked with leaves of softest gray and low. It grew heavy as he held it, and glittered like a piece of his crown. He stooped to touch the green turf on which some fragrant violets grew, and turf grew into cloth of gold, and violets lost their fragrance and became hard, solid, golden things. He touched an apple whose cheek grew rosy in the sun, and at once it became like the golden fruit in the garden of the Hebrides. The stone pillars of his palace, as he brushed past them on entering, blazed like a sunset sky. The gods had not deceived him. Midas had the golden touch. Joyously he strode into the palace and commanded a feast to be prepared, a feast worthy of such an occasion so magnificent. But when Midas, with the healthy appetite of the peasant born, would have eaten largely of the savory food that his cooks prepared, he found that his teeth only touched roast kid to turn into a slab of gold, the garlic lost its flavor and became gritty as he chewed, that rice turned into golden grains, and curdled milk became a dower fit for a princess, entirely unnegotiable for the digestion of men. Baffled and miserable, Midas seized his cup of wine. But the red wine had become one with the golden vessel that held it, nor could he quench his thirst, for even the limpid water of the fountain was melted gold when it touched his dry lips. Only for a few days was Midas able to bear the application of his wealth. There was nothing now for him to live for. He could buy the whole earth if he pleased, but even children shrank in terror from his touch, and hungry and thirsty and sick at heart, he wearily dragged along his weighty robes of gold. Gold was power, he knew well. Yet of what worth was gold while he starved? Gold could not buy him health and life and happiness. In despair at length he cried to the god who had given him the gift that he hated. "Save me, O Bacchus," he said. "A witless one am I, and the folly of my desire has been my undoing. Take away from me the accursed golden touch, and faithfully and well shall I serve thee forever." Then Bacchus, very prettily for him, told Midas to go to Sardis, the chief city of his worshippers, and to trace to its source the river upon which it was built, and in that pool, when he found it, he was to plunge his head, and so he would for evermore be free of the golden touch. It was a long journey that Midas then took, and a weary and starving man was he when at length he reached the spring where the river Pactolus had its source. He crawled forward and timidly plunged his head and shoulders. Almost he expected to feel the harsh grit of golden water, but instead there was the joy he had known as a peasant boy when he laved his face and drank a cool spring, when his days of toil was ended, and when he raised his face from the pool, he knew that his hateful power had passed from him. But under the water he saw grains of gold glittering in the sand, and from that time forth the river of Pactolus was noted for its gold. One lesson the peasant king had learned by paying and suffering for a mistake. But there was yet more suffering in store for the tragic comedian. He had now no wish for gold and riches, nor even for power. He wished to lead the simple life and to listen to the pipings of Pan along with the goat herds of the mountains or the wild creatures in the woods. Thus it befell that he was present at a contest between Pan and Apollo himself. It was a day of merrymaking for nymphs and fauns and dryads, and all those who lived in the lonely solitudes of Phrygia came to listen to the music of the god who ruled them. For as Pan sat in the shade of the forest one night and piped on his reeds until the very shadows danced, and the water of the stream by which he sat leaped high over the mossy stones that passed, and laughed aloud in glee. The god had so gloried in his own power that he cried, "Who speaks of Apollo and his lyre? Some of the gods may be well pleased with his music, and mayhaps a bloodless man or two. But my music strikes to the heart of the earth itself. It stirs with rapture the very sap of the trees, and awakes to life and joy the innermost soul of all things mortal." Apollo heard his boast, and heard it angrily. "O thou whose soul is the soul of the untilled ground," he said, "wouldst thou place thy music that is like the wind in the reeds beside my music, which is as the music of the spheres?" And Pan, splashing with his goat's feet amongst the water lilies on the stream of the bank of which is said, laughed loudly and cried, "Yea, would I, Apollo, willingly would I play thee a match, thou on thy golden lyre, I on my reeds from the river." Thus did it come to pass that Apollo and Pan matched against each other their music, and King Midas was one of the judges. First of all Pan took his fragile reeds, and as he played, the leaves on the trees shivered, and the sleeping lilies raised their heads, and the birds ceased their song to listen, and then flew straight to their mates. And all the beauty of the world grew more beautiful, and all its terror grew more grim. And still Pan piped on and laughed to see the nymphs and the fauns first dance in joyousness and then tremble in fear, and the buds to blossom and the stags to bellow in their lordship of the hills. When he ceased, it was as though a tensely drawn string had been broken, and the earth lay breathless and mute. And Pan turned proudly to the golden-haired god who had listened as he had spoken through the hearts of reeds to the hearts of men. "Canst then make music like unto my music, Apollo?" he said. Then Apollo, his purple robes barely hiding the perfection of his limbs, a wreath of laurel crowning his yellow curls, looked down at Pan from his godlike height and smiled in silence. For a moment his hand slightly played over the golden strings of his lyre, and then his fingertips gently touched them. And every creature there who had a soul felt that that soul had wings, and the wings spread them straight to Olympus. Far away from all earth-bound creatures they flew, and dwelt in magnificent serenity amongst the immortals. No longer was there strife or any dis-ease. No more was there fierce warring between the actual and the unknown. The green fields and the thick woods had faded into nothingness, and their creatures and their fair nymphs and dryads and the wild fawns and creatures longed and fought no more. And man had ceased to desire the impossible. Throbbing nature and passionately desiring life faded into dust before the melody that Apollo called forth, and when his strings had ceased to quiver and only the faintly remembered echo of his music remained, it was as if all the earth had passed away and all had become new. And for the space of many seconds, all was silent. Then in a low voice Apollo asked, "Ye who listened, who is the victor?" The earth and sea and sky, and all the creatures of earth and sky and of the deep replied as one, "The victor is thine, divine Apollo." Yet there was one dissentient voice. Midas, sorely puzzled and ununderstanding, was relieved when the music of Apollo ceased. "If only Pan would play again," he murmured to himself. "I wish to live, and Pan's music gives me life. I love the woolly wine buds and the fragrant pine leaves and the scent of the violets in the spring. The smell of the fresh plowed earth is dear to me, the breath of the kine that have grazed in the meadows of wild pursley and of asphodel. I want to drink red wine and to eat and love and fight and work and be joyous and sad, fierce and strong and very weary, and to sleep the dead sleep that only weak mortals do." Therefore he raised his voice and called very loud, "Pan's music is sweeter and truer and greater than that of Apollo's. Pan is the victor, and I, King Midas, give him the victor's crown." With scorn ineffable, the sun god turned upon Midas, his peasant face transfigured by his proud decision. For a little he gazed at him in silence. Then his look might have turned a sunbeam into an icicle. Then he spoke. "The ears of an ass have heard my music," he said. "Henceforth shall Midas have ass's ears." And when Midas in terror clapped his hands to his crisp black hair, he found growing far beyond it the long pointed ears of an ass. And perhaps what hurt him most as he fled away was the shout of merriment that came from Pan. And fauns and nymphs and satyrs echoed that shout most joyously. Willingly would he have hidden in the woods, but there he found no hiding place. The trees, the shrubs, and flowering things seemed to shake in cruel mockery. Back to his court he went and sent for the court hairdresser, that he might bribe him to devise a covering for these long, peaked, hairy symbols of his folly. Gladly the hairdresser accepted many and many a bly, many and many of golden gifts, and Phrygia wondered while it copied the strange hairdress of the king. But although much gold has bought his silence, the court barber was unquiet of heart. All day and all through the night he was tormented by his weighty secret, and at length silence was to him a torture too great to be borne. He sought a lonely place, dug a deep hole, and, kneeling by it, softly whispered to the damp earth, "King Midas has ass's ears." Greatly relieved, he hastened home, and was well content until, on the spot where his secret lay buried, rushes grew up, and when the winds blew through them, the rushes whispered for all those who passed by to hear, "King Midas has ass's ears. King Midas has ass's ears." Those who listen very carefully to what the green rushes in marshy places whisper as the wind passes through them may hear the same things to this day. And those who hear the whispers of the rushes may, perhaps, give a pitying thought to Midas, the tragic comedian of mythology. The end.